Assassin's Creed Valhalla is a long game, but what took even longer than completing it was truly organising how I felt about the most recent entry into the franchise of Assassin's Creed. Valhalla is quite a confusing game, with too many moving parts to simply cram into a 10-minute video, and although I've tried to do that in the past, I figured it was about time that I actually went in deep on Assassin's Creed Valhalla and try to find out if this game is just as bad as many people think it is. And where else to start but the beginning, as we're placed into the shoes of a young Eivor in the midst of a massive Norse feast. When I first saw this scene, I was taken aback by its beauty, but more so by the immersive feeling of the moment, as the fall of Eivor's clan at the hands of Kjotve the Cruel is presented in a cutscene legitimately on par with the likes of Red Dead 2 and Uncharted 4. The scene is perfectly paced, with a slow build-up that truly makes you connect with the characters of Eivor's clan before a sudden tragic climax. That slow build-up works perfectly within the context of the scene, but then it's transposed onto the rest of the game, and to say the least, it doesn't work as well spread over 60 hours as it does over 5 minutes, but we'll get to that. To be honest, the brilliance of Valhalla's opening doesn't end with the tragic death of Eivor's father. After picking the gender of your Eivor, which makes enough sense lore-wise for me to not complain about it, you're thrown 17 years into the future, beset on hunting down the man who killed your father. It's a plotline that we've seen often used in the series, however, it's not abused in Assassin's Creed Valhalla. It never becomes the driving motivation for Eivor, and I can appreciate that considering how often we've seen it before. The Eivor we see is reminiscent not of Ezio at the start of his journey, but of Bayek at the beginning of Origins, a warrior shaped by hardship, never knowing a life outside of fighting, and with that she wastes no time swiftly dispatching her captors. The escape from this random island in Norway with nothing but an axe in hand was the perfect way to ease us into the open world, giving the player breathing room after the intense opening to appreciate the fairly gorgeous scenery. And after you return to your longship, this is doubled down on, with the entire sea of Norway open for you to explore. Returning home to Fornburg, you're immediately given the option to play Orlog, and of course I went on to spend the first hour of my Valhalla experience throwing around dice. But after you put the dice down, you're sent to meet the members of your clan, firstly with the absolute legend that is Forrest Gunnar, along with Valka and her mother Svala, the mountaintop seers that immediately send Eivor down a drug-infused dream sequence where you see your brother Sigurd with an arm lopped off and a wolf by his side. Now, you'd assume this vision would be the main focus of most of the game's story, but it's not, and it doesn't really impact anything until about 50 hours later. To be honest, I forgot it even happened until the end, so that's probably not a great sign. Speaking of Sigurd, Eivor returns to her village to find her brother returned along with two new faces, both wearing hoods that would make any long-term fan of the series come everywhere. That mental image isn't necessarily something I wanted to think of, but we move. Basim and Hytham, the two hidden ones, the two assassins, the only two assassins in the entire main story. I mean, I said about 6 months before Assassin's Creed Valhalla came out that it wouldn't be an Assassin's Creed game, but that is still a bit of a disappointment. Regardless of personal annoyances, Hytham and Basim are introduced well, the same way most supporting characters in this game are, because that is one of Darby McDevitt's greatest strengths, writing supporting characters. The peculiarity of Basim handing Eivor a hidden blade after meeting for the first time immediately plucks up both Hytham and the player's intrigue, as Basim is presented as a mentor figure, an Altair Ezio figure in this context. I must say though, running through essentially the exact same hidden blade tutorial as Black Flag does feel a little bit forced, with it coming across as if Ubisoft wanted to get past any classic AC mechanics as quickly as possible to get back to epic Viking raiding. And that's exactly what happens, as after making an alliance with the Norse king Harald, you begin to prepare a siege on Kjotve's seemingly impregnable fortress, the first of many sieges Valhalla presents, and arguably the best, with a climactic final showdown between Eivor and Kjotve that not only solidifies Eivor's motivations of glory, honour and fame, but also throws in a cheeky bit of fan service. From here, we're suddenly faced with a whole lot of feudal politics, which again come up time and time again throughout Valhalla. King Harald forms a truce across Norway, a truce that defends Kjotve's son, Gorm, but with Eivor obsessed with honour and glory, she swiftly moves to find him, despite her father already being avenged, and with the help of Basim, she tracks him down. It's here we get our first introduction to the stealth of Valhalla, a seemingly divisive topic with players. On the one hand, the game finally brings back the iconic social stealth that made you feel like a blade in the crowd in past games, as well as instant assassinations. On the other hand, the system is very circumstantial. You may only blend with the crowd when the game provides you a specific prompt to do so, you only go unseen if you walk as slowly as possible, and along with that, the detection time is minuscule, meaning you only need to be glimpsed by a guard for their entire squadron to instantly be alerted to your presence. There's a fine line between difficult, punishing stealth and frustrating, inconsistent stealth, and Valhalla pushes that line a bit too far. The stealth can be be massively satisfying when you pull it off perfectly. However, when you accidentally start jogging or an assassination prompt doesn't appear behind a guard, your immersion completely breaks and you're left infuriated. If you want a fantastic in-depth look at Valhalla stealth, I would recommend any of Jacer's or Leo K's videos on the topic. Valhalla also suffers a similar issue to Assassin's Creed Black Flag, that being a lack of balance between stealth and combat, which all comes down to risk versus reward. In order to have any true incentive to use a stealth system, the reward has to be noticeably larger than the risk, which in this case is getting into combat in the first place. But the combat of Valhalla is barely an inconvenience throughout most of the game, similarly to Black Flag, as Eivor can plow through hundreds of enemies at a time without any real risk of death. If simply running into a fortress and beheading every guard inside it is more efficient and more rewarding than using stealth, then why use the stealth system at all? Take Assassin's Creed Unity for example, a game with plenty of flaws, but the dichotomy between stealth and combat in that game to me is near perfect. During the main black box missions of the game, the player is massively encouraged to use stealth, to embrace the feeling of being an assassin, being a blade in a crowd, and if you're able to make your way through one of these missions without being seen, it makes the entire experience fluid, immersive, and rewarding, both extrinsically and intrinsically. If you're seen, however, you pretty much immediately have to sprint away, with the combat system of that game being far more engaging, with most players not able to take down more than 4 or 5 enemies at a time without taking considerable damage. The risk of the combat pushes the player to engage in the stealth system, and that isn't present at all in Valhalla. It's an issue that plagues a fair bit of the game, as it leaves one of the main components of the series completely by the wayside, which is disappointing considering promises of a return to social stealth. Now when I first played the game, I had very little to say about it. In my opinion, it was simply a more balanced and less tedious version of Assassin's Creed Odyssey's combat. However, it was 1 month after the release of Assassin's Creed Valhalla when Ubisoft made a decision. They made a decision to release a patch that would make it so that enemies wouldn't be able to be much weaker than you, and along with that, all of the bosses in the game would be level scaled to you. Now at first this sounds like an annoying but not major problem. That's until you hear that Ubisoft also at the same time added XP boosts into the game's store. Those 2 additions were made a month after the game's release, meaning they weren't in any of the initial reviews. And why did Ubisoft do that? Well, essentially to push even more microtransactions. By scaling the enemies up, by making the combat system far more tedious and drawn out, the option to buy XP boosts becomes more and more enticing. Essentially, this change brings back the damage sponge tedious elements of Odyssey's combat, making the time needed to complete the game even longer. And who wants to spend 100 hours grinding when they could just spend $20 on an XP boost? Moving on from there though, we get some more feudal politics, as King Harald wishes to take control of the whole of Norway, and Sigurd's father allows it, a crime Sigurd sees as unforgivable as glimpses of his god complex come to light. Convinced that nothing is left for them in Norway, Sigurd and Eivor, along with Basim and most of the clan, head on their way to a new mysterious land, England, a land of opportunity, wealth, and unconquered territory. And with that, Assassin's Creed Valhalla truly begins. From the very moment it's introduced, the modern day of Valhalla feels completely unbelievable. Not since 2012 has the series truly provided a modern day worth its salt, with most of the segments being forgettable, dull, short, and worst of all, unimportant. The core of Assassin's Creed from the very first game was its modern day, and the first 5 entries provided incredible stories with Desmond and the gang, each building on the last, each providing something of intrigue, building on the story that came before. But after Assassin's Creed 3 in 2012, that went out the window. Despite a clear story being set up with Juno's escape, it was never truly followed up on, with Juno, the main antagonist of the series, being cast to the sidelines before eventually being killed in a comic book. So even seeing some kind of story being established in these modern day segments was miraculous, let alone what would come later. We see Layla, Sean, and Rebecca have all been weathered by their traumas, but continue to fight for good, and most interestingly of all, we see that Eivor has been buried in America, a hugely intriguing mystery that's still, to this day, 2 years later, never been followed up on. Listen, this game has one more DLC, I guess we're gonna find out everything there. Along with that, Layla's computer is filled with notes, details, interesting information, and best of all, Desmond Miles. The modern day has truly not felt the way it does in Valhalla since Assassin's Creed 3, hell, since Brotherhood, and it brought me back to 2010, immediately filled with curiosity about this new world we see Layla living in. Returning to the Animus, Eivor finally reaches England, and after a couple of cheeky bandit camps along the river, the Raven clan find a spot of land perfect to set up their new settlement. However, this settlement system, an aspect of the game that seemed really intriguing during the lead up to the game, ends up being a notable disappointment. Instead of the engaging dynamic system I expected, we instead essentially get a reskin of the Monte Regione system from 2009 with a couple of added missions. Having some kind of base, a safe house area that you could build and customize was always a great part of games like AC2, 3, and even Black Flag to an extent. And to me, you should expect more of an upgrade from a next-gen game, but Valhalla provides the same formula of simply buying buildings for characters that you don't have much connection to. And these workhouses and homes are built through the gains of the raiding system, yet another system that lets Valhalla down. I promise I will get to the good parts in a bit. Introduced almost immediately, the monastery raids sprinkled across Eivor's new home feel as if they should be an intrinsic part of the Viking fantasy Ubisoft advertised so heavily. And despite me not being a fan of that fantasy, I still have to say the execution of it is subpar at best. Every single raid consists of beaching at what feels like identical monasteries, where you're sent on your way to find 3 or 4 of the exact same chests of loot, all whilst chopping through hundreds of faceless Anglo-Saxons. Personally, I took on these raids only when I happened to come across them in the path of the main story. However, after that main plot ended, I was stuck being forced to trail back around the rivers of England in order to get each one of these plunder-adorned chests. Now, you could make the argument that Black Flag did the exact same thing here, that the ship battles of Assassin's Creed 4 are the same, with the repetitive structure tailored to create a period fantasy, as well as to upgrade your home base with supplies. And conceptually, you wouldn't be wrong. The raid system and the naval battles are inherently similar systems, however, there's a notable gap in quality between the two. Running into ships on the Seven Seas was a dynamic experience, an experience we'd never truly seen perfected in a game, and the fundamental brilliant foundation of the naval gameplay was what allowed Assassin's Creed 4 to be built on fun encounters that created a risk-reward element with the like of Man of Wars, which are massively more powerful than other ships in the game, but also massively more resourceful. You never know if you're going to run into a ship, or if said ship will even be worth attacking, but when you do, it's a completely different experience to that of the rest of the game. The land gameplay and the naval gameplay, the assassin gameplay and the pirate gameplay, they're distinct, they're separate from one another. Valhalla's raids, however, are mapped out from the moment you unlock them, each being structured the exact same way. Since every single monastery holds the same amount of loot, there's no real progression system or hierarchy outside of your power level, there's no elements of risk reward. And most importantly, Valhalla's raids don't provide any variety to gameplay. And this goes back to the problem of Valhalla not having any classic Assassin's Creed gameplay for the raids to bounce off of in the first place. You play as this epic Viking raider from the very start of the game to the very end, chopping through Anglo-Saxons and sieging fortresses. So these raids just act as more of the same things you're already doing in the main story, becoming indistinguishable from the rest of the game, and with that becoming forgettable. A system that certainly isn't forgettable though is the Alliance map, the core of Valhalla's main story. Since they're new to the land, the Raven clan understandably need allies if they're going to expand their settlement, and so Eivor is tasked with forging alliances across every single section of the country. Which, if you ask me, is a lot to ask of one person, but we need a game, so she gets that task. In the meantime, Basim and Sigurd ride to Oxfordshire with a mysterious intention, leaving Eivor to essentially run the clan by herself. And so she begins to make her way around England, and for a while the game is smooth sailing, with countless memorable arcs that truly exhibit Darby McDevitt's masterful crafting of supporting characters, with the likes of Ivar and Uber Ragnarsson, Soma and Shiobert all making an immediate splash with their various dynamics and arcs. Along with that, Hytham, Basim's young student, not only teaches Eivor the leap of faith in a small but poignant quest, but also sets her a task, to find 6 codex pages across the land that tells tales of the Hidden Ones, as well as help in hunting down the Order of the Ancients. Yes, Hytham the assassin pawns the work of killing the Order off onto this random Viking he's met twice. It's still weird, and this still isn't an Assassin's Creed game, but anyway. There's already a lot going on in this game, but regardless, Hytham adds 45 targets to our already bloated to-do list. Speaking of which, it's around this time that, given you follow the power levels, you get to the East Anglia arc, and the biggest flaw in all of Valhalla starts to show. One of the biggest selling points of Valhalla to hardcore fans of the series was that there would be no quote-unquote mandatory side content, the likes of which was so present in Origins and Odyssey. By that, I mean the near countless side quests scattered across the map that had no impact on the main narrative, usually consisted of dull, unengaging mission design, and were also essentially forced on the player in order to level up enough to play the next main story mission. For myself and many others, this sounded like a breath of fresh air, a chance for the series to return to the concise linear stories that made up most of the series prior to Origins. However, this selling point of no mandatory side content was a bit of a facade, because instead of throwing a bunch of side quests across the map for you to complete, Ubisoft instead took these side quests and rammed them into the main story. As you reach East Anglia, a feeling of fatigue fatigue begins to set in. After spending the last 9 hours crowning kings and dethroning tyrants, you begin to think it would be nice if we could see Eivor's personal story truly kick into gear. Because in all honesty, up to that point she's largely been a passive character who simply does whatever others require her to do. But instead we spend yet another 3 hours with Broder, Valdis and Oswald, who all act as mirror image bootlegs of Ivar, Soma and Shiobert, spawning a feeling of repetitiveness within the arc, with it neither giving the player any new dynamics nor having a noticeable impact on Eivor's growth as a character. It's the first of numerous arcs in the game that feel like they only exist for the sake of making the game longer. They could have easily been optional and had no major effect on the story. However, every single alliance across England has to be completed before you can even get close to the climax of the main story. Now I understand that the intentions of Darby McDevitt and the rest of the writing team was to create these insular tales of feuds and voyages, similarly to the way Viking tales are written in the Norse sagas. And although I understand that intention, the issue is that the game itself is structured as a classic open world game, with linear progression and mission types that lean towards a linear narrative. It creates a dichotomy between the experience of the game and the experience of the narrative, and oftentimes it makes the pacing of the game completely erratic, which can further demotivate the player to actually complete the story. The issue is compounded even further with a major flaw with the Alliance map, but we'll get to that later. Because first, we need to head to London and start the first of 3 arcs that will make any longtime AC fan wet with excitement. Why do I keep making these weird analogies? 9 names, 9 men who must die. That is the inciting phrase of the first Assassin's Creed game, and Valhalla, 13 years after its originator, paid a brilliant tribute to that, with London, Jorvik and Winchester all bringing back that same concept. Whether it be a corrupt reeve, a poisonous nurse, or a murderous abbot, tracking down and assassinating the Order members revives the feeling of being that blade in the crowd that was lost a long time ago. As well as that, all 3 cities contain one of the 6 lost assassin boroughs, each of which pay incredible homage to past games, with writings that reference Amunet, the creation of the Hidden Ones, even Altair's criticism of the Creed. It's all fantastic in fleshing out the expansion of the Hidden Ones, as well as providing a completed armor set, which, it's okay, it's nothing special, but you know, it's kinda cool. It's around this point that Eivor's provided the opportunity to travel to Vinland in order to hunt down her old foe, Gorm Kjotveson. And although the Vinland arc itself doesn't have too much in the way of memorable characters or missions, its ending is enough to make any fan of the series get goosebumps, seeing the Grand Temple from Assassin's Creed 3, along with laying the crystal ball for Connor to find years later. Returning to Ravensthorpe, it's time to make your pledge to arguably the most important arc, the Oxenfordshire arc. Why the fuck could England not just make their place names normal? Reaching Oxenfordshire, you find Basim and Sigurd on the run from Saxon soldiers, but still underway with plenty of tasks. They lay out a plan to get one Thien Giedrich to ally with them, and then, I'm gonna be honest, all this feudalism gets really boring after doing it 6 consecutive times. The true focus of this arc is Basim and Sigurd's obsession with finding a mysterious seer, a woman by the name of Fulke, who according to Sigurd holds a secret with the power to turn the tide of their conquest, and so Eivor begrudgingly agrees to trust her brother. It's clear though that the trust between Eivor and Sigurd is waning, and this comes to a head after Fulke is found, and Sigurd declares himself to be descended from the gods. In disbelief, Eivor desperately tries to talk her brother out of this wild goose chase, but regardless, the troop continue with Fulke. But as time goes on, it becomes too much for Eivor, and when Basim and Sigurd offer to sell out their promise to Giedrich, it becomes far too much. She made a promise that would lead her closer to the glory of conquering England, and the fact that Sigurd would betray that in exchange for a trinket from Fulke, it is unacceptable.
You mock-minded fool!
That was our chance to recover the stone without letting of blood.
I will not betray Giedrich.
That is not for you to decide.
My promises are my own, and they are ironclad. Edwin will flee to her castle. You want your stone? It will be there.
Giedrich's pathetic army will never breach the walls. We could have first taken the stone, then laid siege. That was always our plan, Eivor. I had no intention of betraying Giedrich.
It was your plan all along? Yet you saw fit to keep me guessing through your fits of madness.
You are not always to be trusted. Your passions overcome you. I know that. My father knew that. Your father knew it. You move with the wrath of Odin, but you do not have his wisdom. That will lead you astray, Eivor.
After recovering the stone, King Alfred attacks Oxenfordshire, retaliating against Eivor's works across England. And although Sigurd attempts to bargain a trade of men, Fulke reappears, betraying her Danish allies and revealing her loyalty to King Alfred. This truly feels like the turning point for Valhalla, the moment that the narrative ramps up to somewhat of a conclusion, after Fulke takes Sigurd prisoner and Eivor and Basim are left to rescue him. But instead of kicking into a third act, instead of planning a rescue immediately, Eivor simply leaves Basim to find Sigurd and goes back on her merry way around England. After such a pivotal moment in the game, there's a clear motivation for Eivor to rescue Sigurd as quickly as possible, knowing that the dangers of Fulke could leave her brother dead. So when she simply goes straight back to the alliance map to crown some more kings, it actively goes against the player's motivations and dismantles the tension of Sigurd's kidnapping. Now, I will give the game credit where it's due. The arcs themselves that follow this have some pretty fantastic insular stories with themselves. However, you can't truly get immersed in these stories without the thought of Sigurd gnawing at the back of your mind. It's at this point where I should probably mention the mythical arcs that plague Assassin's Creed Valhalla, and yes, I said plague. I'm gonna be blunt. Assassin's Creed, especially its Isu storylines, should not be presented as fantasy. At first, I was okay with how they presented these Odin memories that Eivor goes down when she drinks these drug-infused liquids from Valka. The presentation that this is simply Eivor's mind trying to represent what actually happened in the Isu world, it makes enough sense. However, when it comes down to the actual gameplay, it is absolutely horrendous. The fact that such pivotal information to the story, such vital lore, is hidden within 6 hours of a hallucination of Asgard where you ride a reindeer and fight frost giants, I'm sorry, but if you don't understand why this shouldn't be part of Assassin's Creed, I don't know what to say. The sheer silliness of it all, fighting a 25-foot tall blue version of Jupiter, hearing a scuffed Ezio voice actor to try and ignite some nostalgia, seeing Basim turn into a fish. I'm sorry, but regardless of the epic Norse mythology, this should not be a vital part of the story of a historically grounded Assassin's Creed game. I love how the Isu are implemented into this game from a story perspective. I love the idea of reincarnates that Darby McDevitt introduced, but physically playing through Asgard and Jotunheim was a genuine challenge, because it was both completely unimmersive and downright boring. The Animus Anomalies, on the other hand, explain this Isu story so much better and are pretty much perfect in their execution, whilst being so much more faithful to the identity of Assassin's Creed. Getting out of these drug-infused hallucinations though, we return to England and more specifically to Shropshire, one of those great arcs I mentioned earlier. Arguably having the greatest impact on Eivor herself, she sees Ivar Ragnarsson's bloodlust get the better of him, nearly murdering Chilbert to simply have the opportunity to murder more Saxons and raise his glory. This is the first time that Eivor truly sees the downsides of the Viking philosophy. She sees the path glory and riches can take a person down, a path of betrayal, deceit and evil, a path that she can't stand by and watch Ivar go down. However, like I keep saying, the motivations of the player are so disconnected at this point with Eivor's that it's truly difficult to process the impact this moment has on her. Luckily though, word comes in that Basim has tracked down Fulke's location, a monastery in Sussex, and it's here that the alliance map provides the player a choice. Either go straight to Sussex and save your brother who's on the brink of death, or go to Essex and build up an extra alliance before you attack. Of course, it only makes sense for Eivor's character to go straight to Sussex to save her brother from a witch, and if you do so, you're greeted by a massively climactic battle with all your past alliances by your side. At least it has the atmosphere of a climax, of a turning point for Eivor's story. However, after you rescue Sigurd, after you bring your worn down, tortured brother back to Ravensthorpe, you simply get a single cutscene of intrigue before you're left with even more alliances to build. Sigurd's return to camp again creates incredible intrigue and tension going forward, but then you're left with Essex, far and away the most boring filler experience in the entirety of Valhalla. And not only does this kill all sense of pacing, all sense of character development, all intrigue, but for a 3-hour span, it killed all of my enjoyment of this game. As I've said before, there's nothing inherently wrong with Valhalla's arc system. For the first 10 hours or so of it, it's a refreshing, interesting experience that continually brings new dynamics to Eivor's journey. But when you're still crowning kings and settling feuds 30 to 40 hours into the game, when Eivor still feels like the same character 30 to 40 hours into the game, when nothing feels like it's truly progressed 30 to 40 hours into the game, it can feel very plainly as if you're wasting your time. And that is the worst possible feeling a game can give you. This could have been different if Valhalla's story was, say, 10 to 20 hours long, if it had this slow build-up of alliances with a genuinely brilliant payoff. But when it gets into the 40, 50, 60, 70 hour territory, it becomes too much. It feels as if playing the game is a full-time job, and there's no single player game, no matter how great its payoff might be, that can justify 30 to 40 hours of repetitive, underwhelming gameplay and narrative pacing akin to a snail. Eventually, after 70 hours, I reached the point where I had only 2 main story alliances remaining, Nottinghamshire and Winchester. And it's here that we reach the biggest issue with the alliance map itself, because these 2 locations, these 2 arcs, both come with the same suggested power level. Now up to this point, I'd been doing the arcs in order of power level, so here I came to a crossroads. However, I went to see Hytham at this point, and he explained to me that there were order members in Winchester for me to hunt down. Tonally, it made sense to me that Eivor would go there next. But boy, was I wrong, because after doing the brilliant arc that is Winchester, I was left essentially on a massive cliffhanger, and instead of being able to continue with the main story, I was forced to head back up north and do the completely unrelated arc in Nottinghamshire, annihilating the pacing of the game. Now at the time when I first played Valhalla, I made a comment about this on Twitter, and I got a fair few replies simply telling me that I had made the wrong decision. But here is where my issue lies. It should not be possible to play a narrative single player game the wrong way. It should not be possible for the player to experience the story in an unsatisfying way. If you're going to provide a choice of how you experience the story, which is exactly what the alliance map provides, then each path needs to be viable and consistent with the story being told. This same issue came up with the order in which you do Sussex and Essex, and at both of these points, if you choose the wrong path, your enjoyment of the story can be crushed by out of place, badly paced arcs that often counteract the momentum of the story. This could have easily been fixed if the alliance map simply didn't have any options. The arcs in Valhalla work exactly the same as sequences from past games, so why not simply structure these arcs in a linear fashion to provide the best and most satisfying narrative structures for the player? Ubisoft have this obsession with creating illusions of choice. In Origins and Odyssey, they allowed you to kill targets out of order, but created level gaps to prevent you from doing so. The same goes with Valhalla, and it's a flaw that opens up the player to experience this wonderful story the wrong way. Assassin's Creed has always been a narrative focused series, and despite the arc structure, the same goes with Valhalla. So if you want to tell a linear story, simply tell it. There's no need for this illusion of choice with the alliance map. In fact, it causes more potential harm than it does good. Thankfully, it seems that Ubisoft are learning with this with Assassin's Creed Mirage. However, we're not talking about the future today, we're talking about Valhalla. It's a shame that the structuring of this game is so inconsistent, because the story being told is truly a great one. It's just buried so often under unnecessary arcs, broken pacing, and Ubisoft's desperation to create games that are far longer than they need to be. The peaks of the narrative throughout Valhalla are always linked to the story of Basim, Sigurd, and Eivor's relationship, and if its main story was a tight, condensed experience focused on them, then it'd be consistently incredible throughout. But instead, those peaks are sprinkled few and far between, always leaving you unsatisfied, always leaving you desperate for more and never getting enough. And that's why I say that despite most of the arcs being good, if not great, they rarely feel necessary. They feel like side content more often than not. They feel like a chore you have to do to get to the true main story, and I wish that wasn't the case. Again, I understand the intention of structuring the game like a saga, but the fact of the matter is, when placed in the context of a video game, these insular sagas the writers created do not feel important. They play the same way an expanded side mission would play, and when you're forced to spend 50 hours on them to see the conclusion of the main story, well, I can understand why so many people said that Valhalla at its release wasted their time. That all being said though, the main conclusion of Valhalla may be, actually, no. It is the best we've seen in a long time. Eivor and Sigurd's journey to Norway has the perfect balance of tension and excitement. Entering into the Norse temple is an incredible experience, especially if you've gained the context of the Asgard arcs and the Animus anomalies. Being transported to the coded dream world of Valhalla feels terrifying as you try and wrap your brain around all that's going on. Eivor's confrontation with Odin, the memories of her friends and allies guiding her to the light, her dismissal of her acts and her glory, the themes are all executed near to perfection, and Eivor's final words to Odin before casting him out of her mind are simple yet beautiful.
Leave me now. You are nothing. With me, have wisdom, glory, power. What more do you need?
Everything else
And then Basim's betrayal as you realise he's the reincarnate of Loki takes you completely off guard. And although the final boss fight is pretty underwhelming, him being taken into the Asgard tree lays the foundation for the best modern day segment in this entire series in almost a decade. Layla Hassan, a character who to say the least was done dirty in the past by lazy writing, was somehow able to be redeemed in Valhalla, going into the depths of the earth to save the world, just as Desmond did 8 years prior, but this time with the Staff of Eden. And this moment is an ode in itself to Darby McDevitt. Never before have I seen a writer be able to pull together so many narrative threads and make them work. Narrative threads spanning a 75,000 year timeline, from Isu Asgard to Viking England to the modern day. Not only was the interweaving of the threads in this game great, but this ending brings back lore and plot points set up a decade ago, theories that Desmond was in the Grey, vague warnings from Juno, finding Eve, awakening the Sixth. It all ties together in this beautiful portrait as we see Layla sacrifice herself, just as Eve did, to save the human race from disaster, to awaken the human race from their unconscious path to disaster. And it's all embodied in one of the final shots we see, Layla and Desmond together by the tree, leaning on symbolism and art of Adam and Eve. The love I had for the series' overarching story was lost for a long time, and after Odyssey I truly thought it would never be revived, but Valhalla did that and then some. And although it was mostly through the power of retcons, Darby McDevitt was still able to bring some closure to the overarching story of the past 13 games, while still setting up multiple new conflicts and storylines to be followed up on in the future in Mirage. It is truly miraculous, and although it's not near perfect, it's the key that I feel this franchise has missed since 2012. As we enter back into the Animus as Basim, we still have plenty to get done around England. Eivor, now the leader of the Raven clan, continues her conquest throughout the country, and honestly the endgame of Valhalla is more than solid, with the extra missions, Ravensthorpe arc and general exploration all being genuinely fun. Along with that you have the Order of the Ancients questline, which has its ups and downs to say the least. Although some of the many targets have quality White Room scenes that provide a true impact to Eivor's character, there are simply too many targets. I've always had a love for the idea of Templar hierarchy in this series though, and Valhalla pulls it off fairly decently, with the questlines ending being pretty predictable in its main villain, but nonetheless fairly satisfying. As much as Valhalla isn't an Assassin's Creed game and does not incorporate the Assassin v Templar philosophy in any way possible, seeing the formation of the Templar Order was a fantastic inclusion.
England is no more, Lord. You're the last of her kings, and yet you have no kingdom.
Look around you. God's works are wondrous. They cannot be ignored, nor resisted. In time, all those who accept God will flourish, and all those who defy him will fall away. Should you remain in England, you too will one day be her subject.
Oh, bloody crumbs! The cakes are burned! Where is that man? Young man, where have you gone?
Damn. That may have earned me a night of washing linens. I do not know if we shall meet again, Eivor. God willing we will. As one lord to another, perhaps.
However, I do have a major issue with the ending of this questline, a problem that is pretty sizable despite it appearing in a 2-minute cutscene. Eivor returns to Ravensthorpe, informs Hytham that the Order of the Ancients in England are finished, and Hytham reacts by offering Eivor a chance to join the Hidden Ones. Now, it would have been fair enough if Eivor didn't want to join because she had to lead her clan, or something along those lines. But no, instead, Eivor gives this reason for not becoming a Hidden One.
If you would join us, become a Hidden One.
Was this your ultimate goal, Hytham? A trial by fire? It is a kind offer, but I do not believe we fight for quite the same cause. Your creed demands that you keep your triumphs hidden. I prefer my glory to be in plain view for all to see.
If I taught you our creed, if you spent time with it, it could open your mind to another view.
Another view is always welcome. But to live without celebrating one's glory and honor and achievements is not a life for me.
So Eivor's entire arc throughout the game is that she lets go of her obsession with glory and power and status. But she doesn't become an assassin in an Assassin's Creed game because she wants glory. It's a truly bittersweet moment, especially after hours of hunting down the Order, and when any character makes a decision that goes completely against their entire arc, well, it's bound to leave a bad taste in people's mouth. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is confusing, but in my opinion, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is good. It is a good game, a game that shows glimpses of greatness, a game that's weighed down massively by its flaws, but a game that's good nonetheless. Is it a complete waste of time? No. Does the story justify 75 to 100 hours? Definitely not. However, I could probably count the amount of games that could justify that on one hand. Red Dead 2, The Witcher 3, Skyrim, games that transcend their genres, transcend the medium, era-defining games that leave legacies of true greatness. Assassin's Creed Valhalla is definitely not one of those games, and it definitely doesn't justify being as long as it is. However, to call it a complete waste of time is ignorant to its incredible aspect, to its fascinating arcs, to its dedication to the Viking fantasy, to its dedication to historical accuracy, and its dedication to Darwin McDevitt's love and appreciation of the modern day plotline of this series. The gameplay at times is tedious, and it definitely doesn't fit the identity of the series at all. However, it can definitely be enjoyed in small condensed doses. Its story is consistently inconsistent, and when there's such a disconnect between the player and the narrative, it is hard to truly get invested. However, if you only isolate the fantastic points of the game, this could have been one of the best stories the series has ever told. Darwin McDevitt without a doubt did incredible things, with a cast of quality supporting characters, solid arcs, and an absolute incredible revival of the modern day and Easter storylines, the last of which are probably the game's biggest redeeming points. Valhalla set up the series to go forward and change, to adapt, but it also left it in a place to continue interesting plot threads. It was definitively the end of an era for Assassin's Creed, an era that was more divisive than any other, an era that some love and I think most kind of despise, but an era that was undoubtedly important. Valhalla killed the love of Assassin's Creed for a lot of people, but for others, myself included, it completely revived my love of the series. And for that reason, I find it very difficult to say that Assassin's Creed Valhalla is as bad as people once said. It has fleeting moments of greatness, and over the past 5 years, we've seen very little of those from a once great franchise. And that's why I would call Valhalla the best of an exhausted formula. It was the best case scenario for the series at the time, and although that's not good enough for most, it's led us where we are now, with Mirage on the horizon, and hopefully an optimistic future for the series. Thank you all so much for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure to hit like, and if you're new here, make sure to subscribe with post notifications turned on. Also, let me know in the comments down below, what are your thoughts on Assassin's Creed Valhalla? Do you love it? Do you hate it? Let me know. I'm quite interested. It's been 2 years, and I know a lot of people's opinions have changed, so yeah, let me know. With all that being said, thank you so much again for watching. I've been Joe, aka Founder Scarab, and I will see you in the next one.